Hello, and welcome to this training about reviewing carer assessment reports and making sound decisions about a person's suitability to be a carer. My name is Louise Mulroney. I'm part of the team at the Association of Children's Welfare Agencies that produces resources to assist when assessing and training potential carers. The other members of the team are Jo Roach and Tracy Fleming. I'd like to acknowledge that I've made this video on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge the connection to country, community and family as central to identity and belonging. I know that people will be watching this from many different lands, but wherever we come from, we all need to be mindful that discussions about suitability to care must include consideration of carers' ability to provide culturally safe care for an Aboriginal child. Later in this training, we'll explore that a bit more. So, who is this training for? This training has been developed for members of panels who are responsible for making decisions about the suitability of applicants to be carers. But it will also be helpful for those who are in other roles where they review assessment reports. So you may be a manager who supervises assessors and are responsible for supporting staff as they prepare reports to go to panel. Or you may be responsible within your agency because you are a principal officer or you have delegated authority for signing off on the recommendations within an assessment report. This training will consider what to look for in an assessment report to be confident that there is reliable, relevant and sufficient evidence that an applicant is suitable to become a carer. This training does not assume that a report you are reviewing has been prepared using a particular template, though ACQA is associated with a step-by-step carer assessment tools. The information in this training is applicable to all carer assessment reports, regardless of the tool used. Over the past 20 years, our team have read thousands of different types of carer assessment reports, and this has shown us that an assessor can be using a really good report template, but if they don't have sound assessment skills, they can still prepare a poor assessment report. And conversely, an assessor can use a poorly designed template, but if they have sound skills in conducting and documenting carer assessments, they can still produce a good assessment report. Of course, the better the template, the more guidance is provided to ensure that reliable, relevant and sufficient evidence is documented. But there are no guarantees that a template will be completed as it is intended. So, informed by both our practice experience of reviewing reports, but also by current research and knowledge about how to identify suitable carers, ACQA has produced a checklist for panel members and others to use when reviewing carer assessment reports. The checklist includes general practice issues to consider. Additional practice issues can be added that might be relevant to your particular agency. This checklist can be used when reviewing all types of carer assessment reports, including those for foster care, family kinship, or any other type of specialised care. Before we go through the checklist, I want to give a bit of background about why we have produced it. This checklist is designed not as a tick-the-box exercise, but as a way of providing guidance to those who have the extremely important role of deciding who becomes a carer. We're all aware that carers require qualities and skills that not everyone has, even those who are motivated to apply. But some panels or decision makers are unsure of the evidence that should be documented in a report to demonstrate that an applicant has the necessary qualities and skills. We know that because here at ACQA we have reviewed reports that have been approved by panels but contain significant gaps in evidence. Approving carers in the absence of sufficient and relevant evidence risks future caseworkers needing to spend a great deal of time supporting poor quality care arrangements and in the management of concerns about the quality of care being provided. We're also aware that some panels sometimes require assessors to provide information in reports that is not relevant to an applicant's suitability to provide care. We have read plenty of those types of reports as well and are sometimes told that the panel requires that information to be in the report. Gathering and documenting irrelevant information can use a great deal of an assessor's time, which is a too valuable resource to waste. Often the additional information sought by a panel is about specific details of past adverse experiences that are not relevant to an applicant's suitability. This risks harm to the agency-carer relationship if an assessment report is subpoenaed by court in a contested matter, which is becoming more common. I'll be talking later in this training about what details of past adverse experiences are necessary and what type of information is not. But we've also had plenty of experiences working with assessors who are dealing with panels who apply robust and appropriate criteria when they review their reports. The rest of this training will be spent going through the checklist in detail. We hope this checklist reinforces good practice, as well as giving you the opportunity to consider areas for potential improvement in the way your panel operates or the way that reports are reviewed before they get to panel. If the information I present raises any issues or questions for you, please note them down. It may be that they're addressed within this video, but if not, the contact details for me and my colleagues will be on the screen, so you can contact us directly. So, let's get onto the checklist. You'll need a copy of the checklist and its 2 attached appendixes in front of you, either in hard copy or open in another window on your screen. If you flick through the first pages of the checklist, you will see the 5 key areas covered are documentation of assessment process, profile information, recommendations, evidence documented in the assessment report, and panel sign-off. So let's start now with the first section, documentation of assessment process. The first point in this section is that all assessment reports should include a record of assessment activities, including the background checks that have been done and their outcomes, how information was gathered from referees, as well as any other conversations or documents that have informed the assessor when making their recommendations. In many situations, background checks and the reports are done by different people. It must be clear in the documentation that goes to panel if the person preparing the report is aware of the outcomes of the background checks and took this into account in shaping their recommendations. It's not necessary that the panel receives the documents collected in each activity, such as paperwork associated with background checks, including the home environment or safety checks, or referees, medicals, or other reports. It is sufficient that the report documents that these activities have been done and that any relevant information arising from those activities is included in the actual report. For example, a report should always include a brief summary about an applicant's physical and mental health, and the source of that information should be noted. The source should not only be the applicant. Comments from referees should be used as evidence to verify specific aspects of an applicant's suitability, e.g. their motivation to be a carer, their ability to deal with stress, their experience in providing care for children, and observations about their interactions with children and the strength of an applicant couple's relationship. And the record of assessment activities should also include any other conversations or sources of information that inform the assessor's view of the applicants. Conversations with the applicants are a very significant part of the assessment process. The dates and durations of conversations with the applicants, as well as who was present at each conversation, needs to be noted. Reviewers should check that at least 3 separate assessment conversations with applicants were completed and that those were not conducted on consecutive days. As you will see from the attached practice issues, both applicants and assessors should have time to reflect on their responses when participating in an assessment. The assessor must be confident that the information gathered from the applicant is consistent over time. Gaps in information and discrepancies may not be identified without time between assessment conversations. Travel time is often cited as the reason for compressing the time frame for conducting assessments. However, if distance is a significant barrier, it is better to have an initial face-to-face conversation, with the rest of the conversations being held over a period of time but can be done online. Details of cultural consultations with Aboriginal advisors should be made clear in the report whenever a recommendation is made that could result in an applicant caring for an Aboriginal child, as is the case for most foster carers. This is an appropriate point in the training to highlight the importance of having Aboriginal members or advisors on panels. Best practice when assessing capacity to provide culturally safe care for Aboriginal children is to have Aboriginal people as integral members of panels that make decisions to approve carers. And all non-Aboriginal panel members should have undertaken up-to-date cultural awareness training, and Aboriginal cultural advisors must be consulted by panels. Cultural considerations are, of course, not limited to Aboriginal children and their carers. Whenever an assessment is being done for a child from a particular cultural background to be cared for by someone from a different cultural background, an appropriate cultural advisor should be consulted. This is most likely to arise in a relative or kinship placement, where a family member is being assessed to care for a child. So that first section of the checklist is all about the way that the assessment process is documented, so that a panel has the assurance that the process has been a rigorous and thorough one. The second main section of the checklist is headed Profile Information. It's helpful for panel members to get a short summary at the beginning of the report that provides a succinct but comprehensive introduction to the applicants. This profile information is like a thumbnail sketch of the applicants that provides the context for the evidence that is documented in other sections of the report. You will see in the checklist that this thumbnail sketch should include the factual information, age, education and occupation, interests and household composition, including details of children and other household members, as well as a brief physical description of the house. It should also include applicant strengths and any issues of concern that arose during the assessment that were explored and then resolved. This gives an early heads up to panel members so they're alert for any information or lack of information within the report that might be relevant to that concern. As I indicated earlier, a brief summary of the applicant's physical and mental health is required in the profile. However, if there is an issue regarding health that might impact on the applicant's ability to care for a child, that needs to be explored in the body of the report. The practice guidance in Appendix A of the checklist suggests that if there is an indication that an applicant has experienced a mental health issue, sufficient information should be documented so that a panel can make an informed decision about the potential for that issue to affect an applicant's suitability. Such information could include when the mental health issue first emerged, how it impacted on the applicant prior to diagnosis or them seeking any assistance, any identified trigger leading to or exacerbating the symptoms experienced by the applicant, the most recent time the mental health issue has impacted on the applicant, the specific strategies or supports, if any, the applicant has or is in place to manage their mental health, what difference strategies and supports have made, and if applicants are currently on medication for their mental health, the type and amount of medication and changes in medication level over time, and how the applicant would identify that they needed to increase the assistance they currently have to manage their mental health. A final part of an applicant's profile is the type of care an applicant is currently interested in providing. The recommendations made by the assessor and the final decision of the panel may not be the same as the applicant's preferences, but it is helpful for the panel to be aware of them. It provides a context for the panel when reading the report. Panel members will be alert to different issues if they know an applicant wants to provide, for example, long-term care for a girl aged 0 to 5 years, compared with an applicant who wants to provide respite or short-term care for, say, up to 3 children aged between 5 and 11. Additionally, a carer should not be approved for care outside of their stated preference unless this has been renegotiated and agreed with by the carer. That is, a carer who indicates only being happy to care for 2 children aged 4 to 10 for respite care should not be approved for the care of up to 4 children aged 4 to 15 for respite and emergency care. The next section of the checklist is about the assessor's recommendations. As you can see in the actual checklist, recommendations should be supported with sound rationales. They should also be nuanced rather than very general and informed by the particular strengths, preferences and circumstances of the applicants. Recommendations should not be generic, e.g. respite, short or long-term care for up to 5 children aged 0 to 18. There are very, very few new applicants who would have the capacity to immediately provide long-term care for 5 children, whatever their ages. The recommendation should reflect what carers are currently able to provide. If it would be best to start with respite because they have limited experience caring 24/7 for children, then that should be the recommendation. But the report could also state that if they've managed regular respite, including over extended periods such as school holidays, they would be suitable to provide long-term care. This makes it easy to change the type of care they're approved to provide following a carer review. If the only reason an applicant is being assessed as suitable to care for just one child is because of limited space in their home, that should be stated in the rationale. That means there's no need to do any significant reassessment of the applicant if they move to a nearby home with more bedrooms. Panel should check that information about an applicant's life circumstances are congruent with recommendations to provide specific types of care. For example, if a recommendation is to provide care for a child or a sibling group aged 0 to 5 years, and the applicant's profile shows that they're working in a demanding full-time job, you should look for evidence in the report that there was an exploration of how the applicant will manage both the demands of caring for very young children who may have experienced insecure or broken attachments and their work role. Any areas where the applicant would benefit from additional support or monitoring that are noted in the body of the report should be highlighted as a specific recommendation. Important information that those working with the carer should know about, potential triggers or the need to monitor a health condition should not be buried in the report, but passed on so that the carer gets appropriate support. Also, any training recommendations described in the body of the report must also be noted in the recommendations, again, so they don't get overlooked. The final item under the heading Recommendations in the checklist is the assessment sign-off by the applicant to indicate they have read it and have had the chance to make comments. Good practice is that the applicant has the opportunity to read the entire report. This often helps to correct errors in the report, including spelling of names. Sometimes concern is expressed that this breaches the confidentiality of referees. Referees should be told that only comments they have given permission for use will be included in the report. The report can refer to a specific issue that was discussed in depth with an applicant and the outcomes of that discussion without identifying that the reason the issue was discussed was because of information from a specific source. The fourth and longest section of the checklist is about evidence documented in the report. This section starts with a list of criteria that should be explored in each assessment report. More details about each of these criteria is provided in Appendix B of your material, which sets out the way that the step-by-step tool organises the assessment criteria. Even if you don't review reports using the step-by-step template, you may find it helpful to reflect on the scope of a carer assessment. The list of criteria in Appendix B is based on the attributes and skills of carers that current research has identified as contributing to the delivery of stable, high-quality care. I will explain how this appendix is structured by going through the first criteria, which is about motivation. This is at the start of Appendix B. The criteria is motivation to be a carer is realistic and child-focused. The areas that should be covered in the assessment conversation includes exploring motivation with the applicant, their desire, which would include the desire to have their own child, their understanding of foster care, the impacts on the applicant's children, and the impacts on their family and friends. After listing the areas that should be covered when the assessor explores each criteria, Appendix B provides benchmarks that indicate if the criteria has not yet been met by an applicant, but we will look at them more closely later in the training. If there's anything on the list in Appendix B that is not covered in a report that you're reviewing, that is a gap. If there is information in the report that does not come under one of these headings, then it's possible that the applicant has been over-assessed and unnecessary information has been included in the report. But it's not enough to check that information about each criteria has been included. The quality of the information is critical. Does it provide evidence of suitability? The checklist provides you with a guide to indicate the quality of the information. Here's what to look out for. When an applicant are a couple, do the voices of each applicant come through clearly? The report should not be full of they said and they did. There should be statements and examples clearly attributed to one or the other partner. Of course, it's quite common for one person to be more verbal than another, but the report should show that the assessor was able to gather sufficient evidence from each person. The views of all household members, not just the applicants, should be clear in the report. This includes the views of the children of the applicant. For foster care assessments, this should be extended to include the views of children, including adults who don't live with their parents. We know that the attitude of children and the extended family of a carer can have a significant impact on the support offered to a carer during times that are challenging. This is linked with the stability of care that children receive, which is why assessment reports must explore this. And additionally, adult children of carer applicants are uniquely placed to provide information about the parenting skills of their parents. Conversations should be summarised to highlight relevant evidence. An assessment report should not read like a record of interview. If the panel needs to know about all that was discussed, they could just as easily be given a transcript or a recording of the conversations. Only information provided by the applicant that is evidence about their suitability or unsuitability to care should be documented. A little bit later, I'll talk more about unnecessary information in a report. Summaries of conversation should include brief, direct quotes from applicants. Short quotes, a word, a phrase, or a short sentence, helps verify that the assessor is accurately summarising an applicant's ideas or experiences. Panels should be cautious when long quotes from applicants form a significant part of the information in the report. It is unusual for people to respond to questions in a number of well-constructed, grammatically correct sentences. Only the exact words said by applicants should be included in direct speech mark, and that is all that usually can be transcribed by the assessor, who is listening out for key or distinctive words or phrases used by the applicant. Some assessors may record conversations and then transcribe significant verbatim sections of the conversation. But this is not encouraged, as it is very, very time-consuming and unnecessary. As I said earlier, an assessment report is not a record of interview. It is the assessor's job to identify key information about an applicant's views and experiences relevant to the role of being a carer, and to present that succinctly in the report. Reports must include specific and concrete examples of what applicants have done or experienced. All statements in the report about an applicant must be supported by evidence. For an example, a statement in a report such as "the applicants understand the impact of trauma in children's behaviour" is not of itself sound evidence. But it is sound evidence if the report states both applicants understand the impact of trauma on children's behaviour. Chris referred to an experience as a teacher when a child who was in foster care would have meltdowns if the class routine changed. Chris talked about how even small changes made the child go off because it took the child out of their safe space. Chris was able to relate that back to the possible experiences of the child when younger, when change was probably associated with chaos and danger and not by fun and nice surprises. Lee has not known any children who have experienced prolonged trauma as a child, but was able to recall the story of Matthew shown in training. Lee talked about how Matthew distrusted adults because that was how his brain had developed and how that made it hard for Matthew to connect with his carers. Lee commented that it was a bit daunting to think about how long it took Matthew to really connect, but said that he ended up getting there. A report without specific and sufficient examples does not provide strong evidence of capacity. Often reading is a very generic document, lacking a sense of the personalities of the applicants. So that's something to be alert for. Now let's think a bit more about necessary and unnecessary information in a report. We've already talked about concise summaries of conversations to ensure only key information is included. One area where unnecessary information can often make its way into a report is when documenting an applicant's experiences of attachment. While an applicant's life history can be an important source of evidence about their experience of safe and nurturing relationships as a child, reports can often provide a lot of detail of an applicant's early experiences in childhood that are simply not necessary. How they spent their holidays and information about the activities they did as a child is only relevant if it provides information about whether the applicant felt secure and loved as a child. Life histories are a source of relevant information for an assessor to include in a report as evidence of a childhood's experience of nurture, but should not be attached in their entirety as a separate document to panel. Another area where unnecessary details can be included in a report is in sections dealing with trauma, grief and loss. This is where personal and sensitive information may need to be documented, but only when it's necessary to an applicant's capacity and suitability to care for children. The fact that an applicant has experienced domestic violence is relevant information. It may impact on how that applicant responds to a child telling her about the violent abuse they've received, or if a child in their care threatens them with violence. However, it is not necessary for all the details of their experience of violence to be documented. It is necessary in the report to provide sufficient context for the panel to consider the potential for this experience to impact on the care they can provide. The report should only provide a very brief summary of the type of violence that the applicant experienced and when they experienced it. This level of detail should also be provided in the report for any other adverse experience an applicant has gone through, which could include loss of significant people in their lives, miscarriages and stillbirths, sexual abuse, serious physical health issues, mental health issues, alcohol use or other grief that might be including things like transgenerational grief, such as the stolen generations. But after detailing what the experience was and when it occurred, the focus should not be on the detail of the events, but on information relevant to the resilience demonstrated by the applicant when facing those experiences. The type of information that should be in the report is the applicant's description of the impact on them, such as how they felt, what they did in response to their experience, what helped them at the time, how the experience affects them now, what reminds them of that experience, and if they have changed or how they've learnt or grown through that experience. If a report is prepared well, there should be no need for a panel to ask the assessor to clarify or provide any further information. The report should contain all that is needed for the panel to make an informed decision about the suitability of an applicant. Of course, sometimes panels do need to request additional information, whether about a response to trauma or any other criteria that needs to be addressed in the report. The panel bring the perspective of an outside third-party reader to the report. Panel members who have not been involved in the conversations with the applicant or in supervision discussions with assessors where the assessment process is discussed will mean that the panel will sometimes pick up on gaps in a report because those involved in preparing the report have not documented the basis of statements or recommendations made in the report, even though that information has been gathered. They've assumed that knowledge. But if panels are consistently requesting significant amounts of further information, then it is a signal to consider why, or perhaps if, those requests are necessary. If the requests are necessary, then the agency should consider the type of support and learning experiences to offer assessors to improve their ability to prepare reports. But whenever asking for further information after reading a report, the panel needs to be able to identify the potential difference that information would make to their decision about the applicant's suitability, and how that information fills a gap or addresses a discrepancy in the report. A good quality report will explain if there was any aspect of the process of gathering information that was out of the ordinary. For example, if there was a long gap between the start and the finish of the assessment conversations, or if additional conversations were required to explore an issue that raised concerns about the applicant's suitability. It's worth noting that usually 3 to 5 conversations of 2 to 3 hours each with an applicant are usually adequate to gather relevant information. If it takes more than this, there should be a particular reason why. Another quality to look for in a report is that if the assessor is not recommending an applicant, the basis for that is clearly documented. This is where panels may find the benchmarks that are in the Appendix B useful. We looked earlier at the information in Appendix B that listed the criteria required for suitability to be a carer and the issues that should be covered in assessment conversations about each criteria. But Appendix B also sets out the basis for deciding that a criteria of suitability has not yet been met. I'll go through an example to explain how that information is provided. The first criteria covered in Appendix B is motivation. We looked at that earlier. Now, motivation does not just involve an applicant being child-focused in their reason for wanting to be a carer. It's also important to be confident that the applicant's motivation is realistic. That is, that what they think fostering is all about is in line with what it actually involves. An applicant's motivation won't sustain them through the challenges of being a foster carer if the role is not the one they thought they were signing up for. You may remember that assessors need to explore all aspects of motivation with applicants, including whether there is any link to them wanting to have the child of their own, what their understanding of foster care is, and how it may impact on their children, their family, their friends. Appendix B then provides a list of benchmarks that indicate that the motivation of the applicant may not be child-focused or may be unrealistic. These benchmarks include an applicant's motivation to become a carer appears to benefit the applicant or other family member and is not focused on the needs of the child. This can include that meeting financial needs is a primary motivation or getting a playmate for the applicant's own child. An applicant has not identified significant differences between the experiences of being a parent and being a carer is another benchmark. This can involve the applicant not being able to embrace the possibility of a child returning to the care of their own parents, or not embracing working with the agency in an ongoing way, or understanding the parenting of a child being done differently and therapeutically. Another benchmark is an applicant having an inflexible or unrealistic view of the role of a carer, including the potential impact on their daily life, their employment, finances, or other children they care for. Another benchmark is if they are a couple, one applicant expresses significant and persistent concerns about the potential for caring to have a negative impact on their life. And the final benchmark there is if an applicant's child expresses significant and persistent concerns about the potential for caring to have a negative impact on their life. Benchmarks are provided in Appendix B for all of the criteria that should be addressed in the assessment, so you can get an idea of what are sound rationales for not recommending an applicant. You may want to pause the video now to look through them. The next subheading in the checklist is about verifying information. Reports should contain information from a variety of sources. Obviously, a lot of information will come directly from the applicant, but there must be some information from other sources, such as referees, medical reports, observations during training, the applicant's children. Information from other sources must be congruent for the information gathered from the applicant. The assessor's own observations can verify information provided by the applicant. This can include non-verbal information, which should be particularly noted when applicants are discussing past adverse experiences. Applicants' ability to discuss experiences of trauma, grief, and not be overwhelmed by emotion is one piece of evidence that past adverse experiences have been appropriately resolved. Interactions observed by the assessor between couple applicants or between applicants and their children is also evidence of the quality of the relationships the applicant has with others that you should expect to see in reports where applicants are a couple or have children. A third party or all third party information should be specific and from a named source rather than generalised statements such as all referees said the applicant would be a very good carer. The name of the referee or other source of information and any relevant attributes of the source should be provided. For example, Kia, the applicant's friend of 20 years, or Tyson, the applicant's co-worker at the preschool. The next subheading in the checklist in the section about evidence is gaps in the assessment. This is where it's important that those who review reports themselves have a good knowledge of research and best practice. This is needed to be able to identify what is sufficient evidence to demonstrate capacity to be a carer. When the assessment has been completed with a report template that provides subheadings to identify the relevant evidence, such as the step-by-step tool, this will be much clearer to the reader. As the practice issues appendix to the checklist states, the report should contain all information needed to evidence the suitability of an applicant. Some examples of gaps in a report might be one of the criteria listed in Part 4 of this checklist is not addressed. Another gap is that no or few concrete examples are given to evidence suitability and capacity of an applicant when documenting a particular topic. Could be information in the report is contradicted or incongruent with other information in the report without an explanation. A final one is the analysis of the report is not congruent with the information in the report. Earlier in the training, I talked about highlighting early in the report if there are any particular issues of concern that the assessor has had to spend more time than usual on in order to assess whether or not an applicant has reached the benchmark for suitability in a particular area. This process should be documented, and any additional carer support that might be considered appropriate for the applicants is noted. This should be done in both the body of the report but also in the introductory recommendations section. The objectivity of the report is another issue to consider. When you're reviewing reports, you should be alert to assumptions or judgments made because of the assessor's values and or beliefs, such as pertaining to socioeconomic background, gender, culture, age, religion, etc. Assessors can sometimes consciously or subconsciously try to emphasise the suitability of applicants with inappropriately subjective language, such as the applicant is a really amazing person who has so much to give a child in care. Information in the report should not be expressed in an unbalanced way, nor in judgmental terms such as this applicant was uncooperative during the assessment. The assessor can make their concerns clear in the report by being more specific. There were significant gaps before the applicant returned phone calls, which made it difficult to line up mutually convenient times for assessment conversations. While there is only one box in the checklist about analysis, it is a very important one. Without analysis, the assessor has not done a critical part of their job. Assessors don't just document evidence gathered, but must consider the meaning of the evidence as it relates to an applicant's suitability to be a carer. Analysis is not a statement such as, from the information available, it is the assessor's opinion that the carers are competent. As it says in the practice notes in the checklist, the report needs to reflect and examine the relevant information to a well-reasoned conclusion about the applicant's competency. The analysis should only rely on the evidence documented in the report, and it should clearly articulate how the assessor has interpreted the applicant's evidence to demonstrate competency. Under the heading of the appropriateness of evidence in court is the need to use appropriate spelling, grammar, sentence and paragraph construction. Of course, all the other points covered in this training are also important if a report is used as evidence in court. However, it is possible for a panel to get the information they need, even if a report is poorly written. But reports that are not written to a professional standard can be criticised in court if the information is not clearly presented and understood without ambiguity. Ensuring the quality of writing in reports can be a tricky area when supervising assessors. Some assessors are highly skilled in gathering relevant information from applicants, but do not have highly developed written skills. However, being able to present information in a written report is necessary. Writing skills can be quite difficult to develop, but assessors must be able to recognise if they need assistance with this. This can mean using peers or supervisors or online tools appropriately to edit or proofread reports so they are easy to read and understand. If members of panels struggle to understand the meaning of any part of a report, it is important to identify ways to support that assessor to better present the information they gather during the assessment. However, a word of warning to panels. Sometimes it's easy to be swayed by reports that are extremely well written with great punctuation and construction. Ensure you still read those reports carefully to check that they provide all the evidence needed for you to be confident in your decision about the suitability of an applicant. We've now reached the final section of the checklist, the panel sign-off. The first point under this heading is extremely important. Has the potential for panel bias been considered and addressed? The practice issues section of the checklist states that panel members should be aware of the possibility of bias impacting on the panel's own decision-making. This can include the bias brought by the pressure of the shrinking number of applicants to be foster carers when making approval decisions. It can include unconscious bias within panel members, including generalising and projecting concerns from previous experiences with past applications. It's important that consistency of decision-making is not impacted by particular agency biases, groupthink, or pressures to provide care arrangements. Some ways of doing this include always having an external member on the panel, building in processes for panel members to identify potential biases or agency pressures at work in decision-making processes prior to each panel decision being made, as well as periodic debriefing sessions for panel members to reflect on the possible impact of bias or the pressure or scarcity of carers in panel decisions. So what opportunities are built within your decision-making processes to consider bias when making a carer suitability decision? Do you have an external panel member who can challenge agency think? Do you include a pause before making a final decision about each applicant to consider the possible impact of bias? Do you regularly debrief as a panel to reflect on what drives your decisions, including concerns about declining numbers of foster carers? So those are some things to think about. The final subheading in the checklist is about panel documentation. It is not necessary to repeat information already in the assessment report, which should be an attachment to the panel decision report. The documentation required of the panel can be very simple if there is appropriate evidence of the applicant's suitability in the report submitted to the panel and the recommendations of the assessor are accepted. If, however, the panel has used additional information to that included in the assessment report to reach its decision, that must be documented. The panel may have access to other information not referred to in the assessment report, which is relevant to the applicant's suitability to become a carer, for example, from other sections of the agency or information from other agency staff members. If such information is considered when making the panel decision, the documentation must include the actual information and the source of the information. It's also appropriate for the panel to seek further information if there are gaps or discrepancies within the report. Ways of gathering further information include written or verbal information from the assessor based on their existing knowledge of the applicant. Or it could be verbal or written information from the assessor after they've gone back and had a further conversation with the applicant or with other people who can provide or verify information in the report. If the panel does not accept one or more of the recommendations made by the assessor, the reasons for this also must be clearly documented in the panel report. Each new recommendation and the rationale for it should be included. So we have now gone through the entire checklist for reviewing carer assessment reports. I hope you found it a helpful process. Please remember, we do welcome all of your comments and questions, and you can get in touch with us if you think our team at ACQA can assist you to further develop the skills of panel members, managers, or your assessors. Our contact details will be on the screen. Thanks for listening.